So what if you could take your drum mixes from sounding like this to this? Well, in this video, you're going to learn exactly that. I'm going to show you step by step how to get this vibey filtered drum sound. And it's funny that I'm recording this video today because literally earlier today, I was talking to my roommate about this type of filter thing because he's also a musician and he was showing me around a little bit with his cheap little keyboard that he likes to play around with. And one of his favorite features on that keyboard is a DJ filter type of effect where he can play a loop, he can loop something, and then you can do the whole like filter out and bring it back in. And that reminded me of something that I have observed over the years, and I brought it up, and it's like, it's funny how correlated these two things are, filter and vibe. So whenever you hear somebody say something about a song or a mix or a production and they say, man, that's vibey, it's got a vibe to it, almost every time that I hear that, there is a filter present, or it's like a synth sound that is very filtered out, or a drum sound that's very filtered out, or a vocal, or part of the song where most of the mix kind of gets filtered out, like that DJ thing on a keyboard. It's crazy how much vibe that creates, and I just found that funny how correlated that is. Just whenever we hear a filter, we immediately attribute this attribute, I guess you could say, of vibe to that type of sound. So whether your drums are recorded live acoustically with your own drum kit, whether you're using a drum loop or virtual drum software like Addictive Drums, which I'm using, whatever you're using, follow what I'm telling you and you can get this type of vibey filtered out drum sound. All right, let's dive into the lesson. So once again, here are these drums without the plugins. And then here are the drums with the plugins. Just an unbelievable difference, right? So let's go step by step and I'm going to walk you through this. Now, there is some automation happening with one of these reverbs. So I'm going to go ahead and oh, maybe not. Let me see where. Okay, yeah. So that I'm just going to turn that off for now. That way we don't get distracted by that. And then we'll bring that in again here in a second. So first things first, let's start at the top. Okay, so again, here is the drum sound straight out of Addictive Drums. So that is what we're working with there. This is just a preset inside of the Fairfax Volume 1 pack that I have here in Addictive Drums. It's called Electrical Drums. And it's a pretty basic sound, right? There's nothing crazy happening. So I started there, and then what I did is I added an EQ. Now, what this EQ is doing is adding the filter. So as you can see, we're filtering off all this top end here, all the way down to almost 1K. So now it sounds like this. Here's without it. And here's with it. That makes such a difference. And then I do have a boost here between 500 hertz and 1K to boost this range, to kind of get more of that boxy sound, which I thought actually sounds good. And especially because the preset in Addictive Drums for that sound, or the sound we're starting from, is pretty thin in nature. And so I just wanted to give it a bit more of that meat in the mid-range. Now the next plugin here is RC20. As I've mentioned a bunch of times, RC20 is one of those plugins that I just explicitly recommend people go buy. It is unreal how powerful of an effect RC20 can have on almost anything, but especially drums. Especially drums, because listen to what it sounds like without RC20, and then with. It's got so much more vibe to it, and most of that is just simply coming from this tube distortion. Everything else is actually turned off, and we are adding a slight amount of tone here, but it's just a very basic setting here, just adding a bit of this distortion coming from the tube here inside of RC20. That's not as important as the filter though. So you can experiment with maybe a saturation or a distortion plugin instead of RC20, especially in this case, because the RC20 doesn't have quite as much of a powerful effect as it will have on certain tracks that you might use it on. So there's the RC20. And then finally we have the mix tool knob, which is just for volume automation. So I'm not going to get into that now because that's not the most important thing. The next important effect we need to talk about is the reverb. So there are 3 different reverbs on this drum track. Now, you don't need to copy that necessarily, because what you have to understand is these reverbs, if I remember correctly, except for one, I think 2 of these 3 reverbs were already in my session. I had already used the reverbs for other tracks like the vocal or maybe the guitars, whatever else was in this song. I already had the reverb set up on return tracks over here, right? So there's this reverb here that I started with. And let me turn it up. Now that's a pretty cool sound. It's pitched up, and this is just that reverb that I used on a vocal because there's a couple parts of the song where I wanted a vocal layer of an octave up to come through and then blend in with the other vocals in the mix. And since I had that reverb channel with the little altar boy and some other effects set up here using a bit of micro shift to add almost a chorusy effect to it and some width. And then finally, I run it through the reverb at 100% after it goes through the altar boy and the micro shift. And then I do a bit of EQ with using this EQ over here as well as Pro EQ. I ended up making some adjustments here just to shape the tone. And that was probably actually just for the vocal. And then I just ended up liking the way that this reverb channel sounded for that drum sound. And so that's just a great example of if you've already used a reverb or a delay on a return track previously in your mix, don't be afraid to try it out on a new thing. And that's exactly what we did. And it just sounds really good. Now it's turned down pretty far, right? So that's the first reverb we're adding. Now the next reverb is a bit more pronounced. You can hear it a bit more, and that is a hall reverb, which sounds like this. Right, so you can hear that a lot more. That has more fullness to it. So the hall reverb is here on this return track. And once again, I'm using Valhalla Vintage Verb. And I started with the Bright Hall preset. I may have made some slight adjustments. But this is another example of I'm using Valhalla Vintage Verb just because it's the reverb that I know and use and love. And I've become so accustomed to. And Valhalla's reverbs sound amazing. So that said, though, you can, by all means, use your stock hall reverb. Use a stock reverb plugin that you have in any DAW. It doesn't have to be Studio One like I'm using. Use whichever DAW you have. Use a stock reverb. Put it on a return track so that you can send different tracks through it. And in this case, we have a hall reverb. Now, I do have a chorus plugin on this hall reverb itself. So on the hall reverb signal, we have a chorus plugin added to that, which doesn't add a ton generally, but it can help to kind of shape the tone just a little bit. And then we have a pretty substantial EQ moves on this hall reverb as well. Now again, this EQ is not on the drums. This EQ is on just the hall reverb signal itself. It's on that return track, and we're sending the drums through this return track with the reverb. But this reverb signal is being affected. It's going through this EQ, which is pretty crazy. So this hall reverb itself is also quite filtered out. And again, we're using this hall reverb for lots of other tracks in this mix as well. As you can see, all of these lead vocals, acoustic, O's, distorted lead vocals, doubles, the contact, and then of course the drums filtered, which is the track I'm walking you through today. So that is the second reverb we're using there. Again, here's without it, and here's with it. Really nice, right? Now, the third reverb is what you could think of as the accented reverb, because it is automated. It's not there the whole time. It just comes in on certain hits. So I turned this off earlier, that way we don't get distracted with it. But now let's bring this back to where it was, and I think you're gonna really love the way that this sounds, because listen to towards the end of some of these bars where I turn that automation on and I turn this send on to go to that long plate reverb, and it just stretches it out. Listen. Here. Right? One more time. Super spacious. Isn't that cool? So yeah, so this is just one plugin on this reverb channel, on this return track this time, which makes it super easy. And I'm just using little plate with an 8+ second decay time, and the low cut turned up quite a bit as well. Probably, this is what, maybe 500-600 hertz or so. And then we're just getting a really, really long reverb tail on this. And we're automating this send from this drums filter track to only send it at certain times. So let's open up that automation lane real quickly so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the automation here. Whenever this automation comes down here, that send is being turned on. So here there's no reverb. It's not being sent to that long reverb. But then notice whenever it's here, you hear it. And then it turns off again, and then over here as well, and it turns off again. So it's just an automated reverb that comes in on just specific parts of the performance. And then towards the end here, I kept it in a bit longer to really accent it. So it stays in for a longer period of time here, which in context of this full mix, listen to this. So that's the sound. So let's come back here and I'm going to turn these drums on a little bit, make them a little louder. So that's the sound. Now, before we wrap this up, let me show you real quickly the difference in context with this mix. Actually, before we do that, let me show you what this mix tool is, just in case you're curious. This mix tool is simply for volume automation. I use mix tool as a gain or as a fader volume plugin to automate if I want to automate the volume of particular tracks. And I do that instead of using the faders because I like to have the faders free to just move and not be locked into any type of automation. So then we have the mix tool automation here, and that is what is happening here. So we're just sort of riding the fader on this, and I'm bringing the volume up a bit, making it a bit louder towards the end to build some energy. Wait, what happened to the plugins? I turned them off. That would make the difference, you know? Anyway, so yeah, we're just doing some volume automation to help with the flow of this drum performance. Now, real quickly to wrap this up, let me show you what, in context, what this drum performance sounds like without any of the plugins and then with them turned on. It's just like, okay, you know? Now, she's the thorn in my side, my kryptonite, my kryptonite. I don't know how to find this, 'cause I'm usually all in, but so indecisive. Driving through an East Coast, flickering light, my satellite, my satellites. Oh, maybe. So there you go. That is my process for getting this VIBEY filter drum trick. Now, if you want to dive deeper into indie music and creating it and producing it, recording it, then I have a free gift for you today, and it's my 7 steps to a killer indie song guide. I'll leave a link to that in the description if you want a full outline, a full overview, a full plan for taking your next song from start to finish so that you can actually go and make the songs you're trying to make, especially indie songs. That's what I teach people to do here at the Indie Music Lab, is create really, really good sounding indie music. So if you want to get better at creating indie music, then be sure to check out my free guide in the description. So that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.